We've marked out a good, safe spot for your tent, milady. Would you like some water, milady? That was a long ride we had today. Joachim cringed internally as a dozen men encircled Baroness Saradnik's warhorse, fawning over the young noblewoman. Relief had flooded through him when they finally left the undead behind with the 5th Legion, but, now, other potential issues that had slipped his mind entirely rose to the forefront. In addition to the barrage of offers that she was getting for every conceivable thing, 4 of the men appeared to be stepping over one another as they held out their hands to help her dismount. For her part, the Baroness simply bestowed her friendly smile. It was one that he quickly learned to recognize as he accompanied her around the Wyvern Mark and, in this case, it could only mean one thing. Frontier nobles were generally men and women of few words, nearly always preferring to let their actions speak for them. The women were often mistaken for their civilian counterparts, especially since their outward appearances were similar when not wearing armor. There was, however, a whole world of difference between them, and the signals that they gave off could have drastically different meanings. Chosen for what they were, the men of Ray's battalion were woefully unprepared for Lady Zaradnik. "Might I carry your bags, milady? Do you think that warhorse is just for show?" Lady Zaradnik's gaze settled on the smiling man. Joachim watched with morbid curiosity as she detached the 2 satchels resting on her hips from her belt. Her mount shifted sideways as she sent one down into the man's held-out arms with a casual flick of her wrist. Oof! The undignified sound was followed by the clatter of metal plates as the man was knocked flat on his back. The warhorse shifted sideways again as the second 50-kilogram satchel followed after the first. The Baroness was riding the largest warhorse available in the entire battalion, which was then augmented with magic, because the combined weight between herself, her outfit and her belongings was somewhere in the vicinity of 180 kilograms. An average Imperial knight in full plate armor was over half that. It was no small wonder that she usually rode a solita around. She smoothly dismounted on her own, kneeling to free the soldier trapped under her bags. After reattaching them to her belt, she helped the man up. He still seemed uncertain about what had happened, and the faces of the men around her similarly teetered between confusion over the strange event and their ongoing admiration for the attractive young woman. Like the members of Joachim's family or most of the Empire's martial houses, Lady Zaradnik did not market herself as civilian aristocrats did. She, like Joachim's grandfather, had the additional tendency of not saying or doing anything while others ran off with their own preconceptions. If she was feeling particularly mean, she would subtly use the various things that people did based on those preconceptions to bite them in the ass. When Joachim asked his grandfather why he did that, the Baron said something along the lines of never interrupting an enemy in the middle of making a mistake, which Joachim supposed made sense. At the same time, Baron Ward did it to everyone, friend and foe alike, so Joachim was sure that his grandfather just did it out of a sense of sadistic satisfaction. This in turn made him wonder if Lady Zaradnik also had a sadistic streak in her, but the men of the battalion would probably benefit overall from her influence. While they were not inherently bad, the men of the 6th Legion would be considered unproven and uncultured by the rest of the Imperial Army. The army group was primarily populated by young recruits that would have otherwise gone to the 8th Legion, as well as ambitious individuals who were drawn by the idea that the expeditionary army would be out to enact conquests and expand the empire. They were the spares of tenant households, men who drifted to the towns and cities. Such spares found that the safe and comfortable life in urban settings was but a mere product of their hopeful imaginations. An invisible wall lay before outsiders to the hierarchy of urban communities, keeping them from partaking in their prosperity. Destitute and forlorn, these spares were easy marks for army recruiters, who enjoyed the proverbial pick of the litter. Few were literate upon enlisting, and their knowledge did not go far beyond the bounds of their home villages or what they had suffered in the cities. This would be the low point in their lives, however, assuming that they weren't mustered out. The Imperial Army took good care of its people, and with training came competence, confidence, pride and a place to belong. Unfortunately, the 6th Legion's new mandate led to complications in the Imperial Army's educational processes for such recruits. By and large, the 6th Legion rushed through training and raised the men to be conquerors rather than protectors. With this came attitudes distinct from the rest of the Imperial Army. Those attitudes might have been tempered over time, But time was a scarce commodity with the 6th Legion's rapid and radical reorganization. They were strength without substance, pride without experience, and General Ray's battalion had been purposely selected to be free of the shackles of tradition and the influence of other nobles. As a result, the companies of the battalion had the basic training of the Imperial Army, but they were closer in spirit to mercenaries. Ray's mercenaries. In Lady Zaradnik, Joachim saw a chance for many of these issues to be addressed. Noble women had ways of doing things that allowed them to achieve goals that noblemen could not without antagonizing others, and martial nobles, while stern and brusque, were genuine people who had a seemingly irresistible urge to fix problems for the greater good. The women were also far tougher than the men when it came to dealing with difficult social scenarios. As long as certain lines were not crossed, anything and everything would just bounce off of the Baroness' defenses like pebbles off of plate armor. Joachim followed Lady Zaradnik as she was led by her bodyguard to the place that they had reserved for her. His eyes idly scanned the path at his feet as he wondered how her stay would play out. Hopefully, things in the 6th Legion would take a turn for the better. Priest Ward. His vision focused and he looked up at the sound of the Baroness' voice. "My lady. How are guard details usually organized in the 6th Legion?" she asked. "I'm not aware of any procedures unique to us," Joachim answered. "Why do you ask?" "It's just that they all seem to be intent on watching me at all times." He looked past her to where a half-dozen were setting up her tent. The others lurked in the vicinity, looking more like street thugs than sentries. Joachim assumed that they were at least trying to do their jobs, but he saw what Lady Zaradnik was trying to say: they were all trying to do the same jobs at the same time. "I'll inform the sergeant and he'll sort out their shifts." Joachim's voice trailed off. Upon seeing realization dawn upon him, Lady Zaradnik offered Joachim her charming, lopsided smile. He looked over the men in the Baroness' bodyguard. There were 7 cavaliers, 2 rangers, 2 heavy infantry and, with himself included, 2 clerics. Adding an officer would make it close to a standard Imperial patrol. A moment's thought had him realize the root of the problem. The members in a Legion's standard patrols reflected the army group's ratios as a whole. In the 6th Legion, majors were lacking since they were essential for the stations where they were already posted, performing regulatory and communication duties. Clerics, however, had fallen in demand as their borders with the Sorceress Kingdom made frontier patrols along the entire western border unnecessary. As a result, the 6th Legion had nearly twice as many clerics as usual. The men who had volunteered, or rather, competed, to serve as Lady Zaradnik's escorts similarly reflected the army group's distribution of troops. An officer, however, could not simply leave their squad as rank-and-file soldiers could. Thus, they had no sergeant. General Ray did not seem to believe that Lady Zaradnik had any significant martial ability and thought that she would be observing their operations from a distance. All she needed was a group of men to watch over her. It was an ad hoc solution to an irregular demand, but Ray's battalion was, by nature, ad hoc. Instead of providing her with a fully functional squad, Ray had probably picked out what he thought would probably impress or please her. Politically speaking, this was prudent. One wouldn't expect a liaison officer to risk themselves on the front lines, but Joachim doubted that Lady Zaradnik was very fragile. She would go where she thought she could see what she wanted to see, as she often did while working with the 5th Legion. "I'll let General Ray." "Wait." Joachim froze mid-step and turned a questioning look at the Baroness. "My lady." "I'll do it," she said. "I can act as their officer. If it is allowed, of course." "They are your bodyguard, my lady," Joachim replied. "General Ray has done everything he can to accommodate you, and I don't think anyone would oppose your wishes." "It's a novel opportunity," Lady Zaradnik said. "I keep getting nobles and noble scions attached to me, so my interactions with the regular soldiery have been decidedly limited and usually brief. Commoners make up the vast majority of the Imperial Army, yet I haven't had the chance to get to know many of them." He hoped they would survive. In the Imperial Magic Academy, even the scions of high nobles didn't cross girls from martial houses because they were just that terrifying. These men, however, hadn't the slightest clue what she was. It occurred to Joachim that he should probably warn them, but it might have been that he had a sadistic streak too. When the tent was pitched and the men started to loiter about, Lady Zaradnik went over to address them. "Thank you very much," she said with a smile. "I appreciate the help." Not a problem, milady. One of the men was quicker in his reply than the others. We'll help set up your things inside as well. That will be all right, Lady Zaradnik replied. I can see to that part myself. Who is the commanding officer amongst you, by the way? The men exchanged glances, replying to her question with unknowing looks. At least they weren't crazy enough to try and slip false claims past her. In that case, the Baroness told them, I'll be serving as your captain. Before I send you off to pitch your tents, I'd like to know your names. After collecting their names, she organized the tents into a blind alley that opened into the central yard of the encampment. Lady Zaradnik's tent occupied the cul-de-sac at the end, while the priests' tents, which were larger than the other soldiers' tents by necessity, were on either side of it, facing the place where the squad's campfire would be. While the men moved to arrange everything as she had instructed, the newly self-proclaimed captain went over to the quartermaster to requisition supplies. You seem well used to this, my lady, Joachim said as he helped her carry everything back. I must have watched it happen several hundred times, Lady Zaradnik replied. Much of my experience in the 2nd Legion's camps was in the officers' tents or near to them, so I was able to observe many of the mundane administrative duties being carried out. I wasn't assigned a bodyguard, however. I'm at a loss as to what to do with them. That's a good question, but I don't think there's any expectation of you doing anything with them at all. As far as it looks, they've been selected for their strength and appearance. Beyond being instructed to facilitate a pleasant stay and keep you safe, I doubt General Ray has anything in mind for them. Do Imperial Knights receive any recognition for escorting people around? Not unless they have to save the person they're escorting from a deadly situation, Joachim snorted. To be honest, the men here have things backwards, my lady. I am not disparaging of them when I say this, but they're wrapped up in the idea of what being an Imperial Knight is and acting according to that. They have no sense of how things work in reality. Comfortably established Imperial Knights valued escort duties because it would earn them prestige, and those duties also involved interacting with important people. In other words, it was a chance to be seen and make connections. However, prestige and connections only mattered if one could leverage them. The vast majority of the 6th Legion soldiers had nothing to leverage but themselves, and the men of the Baroness bodyguard were no exception. What they needed to do was render notable service and earn their spurs. Once they entered the ranks of the gentry, further achievements would earn them honors, monetary rewards, rank and titles, and it was at that point an Imperial Knight switched their focus to leveraging what they had earned by competing for prestigious and advantageously placed assignments. While genuinely strong relative to their peers, the men in the Baroness bodyguard were doing themselves a disservice. The idea that they were serving as escorts to a young and attractive noblewoman like some knight from a bard's tale was blinding them to the fact that it would not help them achieve the goals that motivated them to enlist in the Imperial Army. General Ray did not dissuade them of their romanticized notions, as they allowed him to cobble together an escort with a minimum of fuss and plenty of candidates to choose from. In short, they were not yet Imperial Knights and would have no opportunities to distinguish themselves and receive their knighthoods. Hopefully, they didn't think that they could ingratiate themselves with the Baroness and have her put in a good word for them. Joachim knew enough about her to know that any such attempts would result in the abrupt and possibly violent end to their careers. I thought something like that would be the case, Lady Zaradnik said. Discharging them from my service so they can apply themselves towards their goals would cause problems, but I believe that I can at least help them earn some achievements. Joachim hid his confusion as he added his crates to the squad's stockpile. Was it really so simple as that? She made it sound as if she could produce achievements on demand. If I may ask, my lady, he said, how does it work in the Sorceress Kingdom? Advancement in the military, I mean. The structure of the Sorceress Kingdom's royal army is such that advancement is a relatively new concept. Martial matters are the responsibility of His Majesty's vassals and their subordinates. All of my work has been undertaken not as an officer of the royal army, but as a noble with the obligations of a martial vassal. Rather than commanding a regiment levied from my vassals, however, I command forces that mostly consist of the undead. I hope you won't be treating your bodyguard as undead, my lady. The Baroness seemed amused by his concern. Her lips turned up in a slight smile as they joined the men around the campfire. While I cannot be absolutely sure, she said, I believe that this battalion already has what is needed to achieve its overarching objectives in this wilderness. You will not require any additional undead, nor will I be treating my men as such. Now, let's see what we can do about getting everyone what they need." The glow of dawn had yet to touch the horizon behind the mountains, but Ray's encampment was already abuzz with activity. Daylight was precious and time was precious. Every moment on the field was a moment his battalion pushed further ahead of the rest of the 6th Legion. To his surprise, Baroness Zaradnik was awake as well, though weeks with the Imperial Army might have accustomed her to its demanding schedule. According to the quartermasters, she had taken her bodyguard, whose members Ray had selected for their strength, clean record and good looks to cover as many things as she might want, and turned it into a personal squad of sorts. She even did the squad's paperwork. He had the forms brought to him, but there was nothing he could discern of particular note. If anything, they appeared to be perfectly routine. The only things that distinguished her submissions from the others were her elegant, angular handwriting and lack of errors. Going by his prevailing assessment of the Baroness, Ray concluded that she was relishing the whole idea of martial life that had become popular as of late. In addition to the central administration's attempts to romanticize military service and draw talented individuals into its ranks, a pair of novels that went by the suggestive title of Dreams of Red had become wildly popular with the Empire's citizens. Those with the means owned personal copies. Even the illiterate segments of the population were familiar with it, as it had been adapted by bards and theatre troupes who performed segments of the story in digestible episodes for crowds of excited fans. It was the tale of a nation on the cusp of greatness, as seen through the eyes of a wide cast of characters. One of the tale's main characters was a certain martial noble named Ludwig, who was an impossibly steadfast, pious and capable man overflowing with martial valor. Ludwig was by far the favorite character in the Empire, and, to the central bureaucracy's great chagrin, he had made the Imperial Army more popular in a year than a generation of their propaganda efforts. Imperial knights spoke proudly of him as if he was one of their own. Men and women of all ages adored him for his strength, loyalty and unyielding sense of order. He was a shining paragon to the masses, a larger-than-life man more imperial than the Empire itself. Rumor had it that the central administration was searching for the novel's elusive author, who went by the pen name The Dreamer to offer them a job, but their efforts had met with no success. He didn't know whether the Baroness was familiar with Dreams of Red, but if she was almost certainly a Ludwig fan. Perhaps she considered her activities in the camps of the Imperial Army something that brought her closer to the popular character. "Good morning, General Ray." Lady Zaradnik stepped into the pavilion, accompanied by Joachim Ward. Even in the rough wilderness outpost, she somehow maintained her immaculate appearance. She wore the same equestrian outfit and had her long hair tied back into a ponytail, which was also a key element of Ludwig's appearance. Ray resisted the urge to shake his head over the fact that someone could be so obsessed with a fictional figure. "Good morning, Lady Zaradnik," Ray smiled in greeting. "Have all our arrangements been to your satisfaction?" "Yes, thank you. The men you've assigned to me have been very receptive." He had no idea as to the extent of her reply. She couldn't already have started bedding them in just over a day, could she? Not that anyone would take issue with it, more like they would line up outside her tent if there was even a hint of having a chance with her. "We have a long day ahead of us," Ray said. "I hope you're all well rested." "They're having breakfast right now." Lady Zaradnik looked down at the maps on the table. "Is this what your battalion will be doing today, Your Excellency?" "Yes, my lady," he nodded, placing his hands on the table. "For the past 2 weeks, I've had the 2 flights of the Imperial Air Service attached to my battalion mapping out this valley and identifying targets. I'll be leading 3 companies in a general sweep of the west side of the valley near this camp, followed by the east side tomorrow. Once that's done, 2 companies will be left to man the outpost and clean up what remains around it while I move further up the valley with the rest." Lady Zaradnik followed his gestures over the map as he spoke. She should at least understand that much after working with the 2nd Legion. "This is far more aggressive than the 2nd Legion's operations in the Blister." "Is that so?" Ray looked at her intently. "In what ways did they differ?" "The army group as a whole was more thorough at consolidating their advance," she replied. "Full divisions created camps from where companies would independently strike at targets in the vicinity. They only moved on once things were cleared to their satisfaction. By comparison, you are personally coordinating your sorties and rotating groups of companies so that you always have fresh men. The companies you station at each outpost will be able to rest in one place, but, in exchange, they will be taking the brunt of the casualties in their cleanup operations. Is this sustainable? Ray's opinion of the Baroness went up by a notch. She at least had a basic grasp of logistics on the field and the ongoing effects of a campaign on an army. Her question was not that of one seeking an explanation of what was going on, but one that challenged the viability of his operations based on working knowledge she was confident in. The conditions in the southern wilderness cannot be compared to the blister, my lady, he offered diplomatically. General Carbane knows his business, so he should have accounted for all of the factors that come with operating in that hostile environment. The arid climes here cannot sustain anywhere near as many demi-human tribes, and the sparser vegetation makes the terrain easier for us to operate in. What about the places that aren't so easy to reach, Your Excellency? Lady Zaradnik's finger traced over the range to the west. These mountains should be inhospitable to most of the demi-humans populating the area, so they'll move to the other side. This eastern range, however, is the edge of a highland plateau that could shelter hundreds of demi-human tribes in a position that is problematic for your forces. My battalion's objective is this valley, Ray replied. The 4th and 5th Divisions are responsible for the western side of those mountains while the rest of the army group tackles the highlands in the east. We all have our parts to play. That being said, Ray had preemptively claimed the valley for his battalion because it presented a clear series of objectives that also happened to be the most valuable to the Empire. By using his smaller force to do so, recognition for those valuable gains would be concentrated on a few number of men. He wasn't sure if the Baroness was familiar with how honors were bestowed in the Imperial Army, but his men certainly did and were more eager to earn them. If I may ask, my lady, Ray said, how did you end up in your position as a liaison officer to the Empire? I suspect that it was because the other two candidates were a frost giant and a goblin, Lady Zaradnik replied. In my work with the 2nd Legion, I found that my background as a member of a human aristocracy was invaluable for the role. For some unfathomable reason, the Sorceress Kingdom had adopted the laws of Reistais. Did that mean she held a post in their royal army because she was a noble? Unlike the Empire, nobles of the Kingdom of Reistais still held martial obligations. If I'm not mistaken, he said, Irantal's laws haven't changed much from when it was under Reistais. Does that mean your new domestic security forces are under the command of the nobility? Within the territories constituent to their titles, yes, the Baroness nodded. Those forces are balanced between Death Series servitors for martial applications while human militia serve in roles that are better suited to them. We also have elder liches who help with administration, customs duties and the organization of domestic forces. Ridiculous. He had to jump through hoops trying to justify the 5th Legion's use of Death Series servitors against random demi-human tribes while the former nobles of Reistais had all the undead that they could want dumped onto their laps. How does the Royal Army of the Sorceress Kingdom factor into all of this? The Royal Army is its own institution, Lady Zaradnik said. Civilian nobles are charged with managing their titles and have no authority whatsoever over the Royal Army. Most of the time, the Royal Army provides security in the capital and outside of the Duchy of Irantal, guards our international borders, trains and is held in reserve in case they are called upon for national defense. Interesting. If it's a separate institution, does that mean they do their own recruiting? Yes, they do, the Baroness replied. But it's a process that hasn't been formalized yet. Before the annexation of Irantal, His Majesty and His Majesty's vassals commanded all of the martial might of the Sorceress Kingdom. The system that they employed, however, operates under certain assumptions that cannot be applied to those of His Majesty's subjects who have different needs. Things become increasingly complicated when you consider the myriad of races that dwell in our nation. I see. Ray wanted to know more, but it probably wasn't a good idea to ask a long string of questions. If he came on too strongly, it might be perceived as being overeager or indicative of an easily swayed character. The way that Lady Zaradnik constructed her responses, while cordial, was entirely neutral, even in her body language. She was keeping a strict distance between them and he couldn't tell what she was looking out for. He resumed the overview of his operations, which by this point had been solidly drilled into his men. By thoroughly going over everything and having it play out before her as described, he hoped to impress upon Lady Zaradnik that his skill as a general was unquestionable and those under his command were the best that the 6th Legion had to offer. This was what dignitaries and authority figures usually like to see, and the Baroness' keen interest in military matters was a potential avenue through which she could be influenced. As the skies turned pale and he ran low on topics to cover, Baroness Zaradnik turned their discussion in a curious direction. I've often heard it mentioned that many men in the 6th Legion are here because it is the expeditionary army and they expect to gain personally from it. Is this true? I would agree that it is their primary motivation, Ray replied. Most of the men in the Imperial Army are spares of commoner families who felt that a career in the Imperial Army offered better prospects than what they otherwise had. Is there a problem with that, my lady? Practically speaking, no, she shook her head. I suppose that it just feels far removed from the Imperial Army's efforts to endear itself to the people. The motivations here are mostly the opposite of the inspiring imagery portrayed by the posters one sees all over the place. The classes in the Imperial Magic Academy similarly promote the idea of employing one's skills in honorable service. That comes down to what a noble sees and what commoners see, Ray said. The Imperial Magic Academy raises new generations of Imperial leadership, so it should be expected that they frame things the way that they do. Most of the students are from aristocratic houses who understand the value of honor and prestige. The commoners who join the Imperial Army, however, are presented with the more practical side of things by our recruitment officers. It's an opportunity to improve their lot in life and they're putting their bodies on the line. I don't think you can rightfully ask for any more than that from those who have nothing to begin with. Lady Zaradnik looked out at the men as they made their preparations to sortie. Her expression, was she doing it on purpose? Anyone who saw her at the moment would have imagined a statuesque princess seeing her people off to war. Though Ray had decided she was at least somewhat familiar with military affairs, he was also certain that his initial assumptions about her being a propaganda tool were not incorrect. In that case, Lady Zaradnik asked, how does a soldier of the Imperial Army earn recognition? How are honors bestowed? What was she up to? She hadn't been taken up by flights of fancy, had she? Scenes of valorous men being knighted on the battlefield and having great celebratory feasts in their honor were common in stories, but unheard of in the Empire. It's fairly straightforward, my lady, Ray answered. A soldier has a service record. This record includes both the merits and demerits of each man in their ongoing service to the Empire, of course. It is regularly updated by their superiors and subject to a periodic review. Each soldier is scored accordingly and they will receive honors upon reaching certain thresholds of service. Scored, as in how scoring works with the Academy's promotional examination? Yes, he nodded, it's very similar to that. I believe the promotional examination was purposely designed to be graded in the same way that the Imperial Army assesses its staff. Rather than a straight pass or fail, it's a general performance review that is both the basis for awarding honors and guiding personal improvement. Can these assessments be treated in the same fashion for the 6th Legion, Your Excellency? What do you mean by that, my lady? The Baroness turned her attention back to the table, her gaze falling upon the maps and reports spread over its surface. My assumption is that this scoring process has been normalized for regular duties. Your campaign here will be much more eventful by comparison. That much was true. The eventfulness of the 6th Legion's activities was something recognized as an avenue for rapid advancement by those who aspired to positions in the Expeditionary Army, but there were realities that came with it that they did not realize. Normally, an Imperial Knight's career was dominated by regularly scheduled domestic security duties. One's service record was filled with watches and patrols that were only very rarely punctuated by combat and other opportunities to display one's quality. In the far more active 6th Legion, however, multiple battles could happen over the course of a day and officers simply could not keep track of everything in the chaos. At some point, what was considered noteworthy in the Imperial Army at large would become mundane in the 6th Legion. This meant that the distribution of honors would hinge on attracting attention by regularly performing deeds that would be recognized as outstanding in other army groups. The floor dash retiring with a pension was the same as everywhere else, but the threshold for earning honors was much higher. Rewards in the 6th Legion would be far greater, but distinctions would go to fewer people. With so much being missed, the army and the administration would resort to broader measures to reward the men. The bestowal of honors would skew towards men of rank and groups that consistently displayed high performance. Thus far, there have been no changes to our procedures to account for that, he admitted. However, I trust that those who adequately acquit themselves will receive their due recognition. In the 6th Legion, There will be plenty of honors to go around. In truth, Ray considered this an ideal state of affairs. It allowed the 6th Legion to attract talented and driven individuals with a mindset suitable for the expeditionary forces of the Baharuth Empire. The Baroness had pointed out this reality, but he still needed time to get a feel for her stance on his operations. Distant clashes cast their clamor over wind whistling up through the valley's scrubland. Distant was the key word, and what Joachim had noted about the predicament of the Baroness bodyguard was quickly becoming apparent to each of its members. Lady Zaradnik stayed close to General Ray, who, as a matter of course, positioned himself in places that offered broad battlefield awareness while staying reasonably secure. This meant that the front lines, or at least what passed as the front lines, were hundreds of meters, if not kilometers away. While the tides of war could shift and turn such distances uncomfortably close, General Ray was an attacker, meaning that he was usually the one doing the pushing and not the one being pushed. The tribes they encountered still appeared unaware of what was going on, so rather than pushing, it was more that the general's forces were trampling everything in their path. This characteristic also extended to General Ray's behavior beyond the battlefield. He was not passionate and open in his aggression like General Belabad, but remained calm and collected while aggressively pursuing his goals. General Ray was an existence that determined facts, dictated events and decided what could and couldn't happen in his life as long as it was within his power to do so. Perhaps this, too, led to his apparent misreading of Baroness Zaradnik. That part didn't matter to the men of the Baroness bodyguard, however. Gains were being made for the Empire and all they could do was watch others collect achievements. Lady Zaradnik remained mostly silent in the way characteristic of frontier nobles, only speaking when she had a question for the general or one of his officers. General Ray, however, was more than happy to fill the silence. "As you can see," he said, "our operations are both far more mobile and flexible than the conservative approach of the 2nd Legion. Without rotating the companies, they wouldn't be able to keep up this pace." "It's still quite demanding even with the measures that you've taken," Lady Zaradnik replied. "When will you be relieving these men, Your Excellency?" "We'll be exchanging them for fresh ones around midday, my lady," the general nodded. "Between the men, their mounts, and our mana reserves, I've calculated the optimal average deployment based on our sorties from the border. Adjustments will need to be made as the situation demands, of course." Ray's tactics were characteristic of his highly aggressive style, which was fairly well known to the generally defensive Imperial Army. Despite cavalry being classically associated with the power delivered through their mounted offense, opportunities to employ that offense, in reality, were few and far between. More utility was found in the ability of their mounts to carry men and supplies as the army maintained its endless vigil over the vast plains of the Empire. The general also took advantage of this quality, using it to create a sort of mobile headquarters that would usually only see deployment when an entire army group performed combined operations. Not only was it a place from which he could observe the battlefield and issue broad commands, but it was also a supply depot where teams of spare horses were led by the general's bodyguard. These horses carried extra lances, spears, bows, arrows and bolts, as well as any specialized tools and supplies should they encounter opponents that required them. Plays of power and influence were also strategically incorporated into General Ray's operations. His hand could be felt everywhere, from his direct command over the battalion's main actions to being seen as the man who supplied them, provided them with opportunities and dictated their overall success. It was an aggressive push in all arenas and his men reveled in that aggression as they achieved their objectives. "So in this broad strategy that you've been employing," Lady Zaradnik said, "I see that you're more focused on breaking the tribes you come across than destroying them. This utilizes the endurance of your forces efficiently in terms of objectives achieved and minimizes casualties. But what of the demi-humans who escape?" Joachim glanced at the Baroness out of the corner of his eye. After her time spent with the 5th Legion, she should be well aware of the reason why General Ray was doing what he was. He wasn't sure whether she was being impartial and giving the general a chance to explain his actions or letting him dig his own grave, though the two were not mutually exclusive. General Ray similarly should have been well aware that martial nobles often let the fact that they were individuals of few words mislead others into thinking that nothing was going on. In embracing her heritage, Lady Zaradnik was the polar opposite of General Ray, who had forsaken his heritage for the values of the civilian aristocracy. "If they decide to linger," the general said, "they'll be picked off by the companies on cleanup duties. Ideally, they'll be driven further into the wilderness and cause problems for the tribes ahead of our advance. So you're weaponizing refugees? That's a good way to put it, my lady. Joachim frowned at the exchange. They discussed the topic as if it were no different than discussing the weather. As a follower of the 6 great gods, he supposed that Lady Zaradnik had no qualms over what was happening to non-humans so long as what was going on did not put humans at risk. Aside from the undead, the faith of the Four held nothing against other races despite being a human religion. It shared a sort of character with the Imperial Army and its mandate to see to the well-being of humanity and defend its faithful. His knowledge was fuzzy when it came to what he knew of the theocracy's belligerent religion, but it seemed fitting that someone who worshipped a god of death readily worked with the undead and showed no aversion at all to the death being sown around her. Their next advance took them to the base of the western mountain range, where a tribe of goblins was fleeing into its wooded slopes. The captain of the company in pursuit stopped his men before their horses entered the trees, wheeling them around to head towards their next objective. Lady Zaradnik's gaze did not leave the mountainside. There will be hundreds of displaced demi-humans by the time you advance to establish your next outpost, Your Excellency, she said. Are the other commanders aware of what may be awaiting them? They have far more men than we do, General Ray replied. Even if they didn't know, these scattered demi-humans would be crushed even harder than they are right now. The 4th and 5th Division scouts and the flights assigned to them will spot and identify any threats well before fighting breaks out, much like how the reconnaissance elements of my battalion do. What happens if these demi-humans begin to rally under a lord? That would be a development we'd have to monitor, but the numbers so far haven't been enough to present a substantial threat to us. It also wouldn't be so simple as the demi-humans banding together because they were driven out of their homes. There would be different tribes, different races, different lord-class demi-humans. They'd take a while to sort themselves out if they ever do. The 5th Legion intercepted several raids led by hobgoblins, Lady Zaradnik noted. Are you not concerned by the development? The presence of hobgoblins is something to keep in mind, yes, the general said, but at the same time we haven't yet encountered any in this valley. Our supply lines will be defended by the outposts that we raise, which should be enough to fend off anything short of an army. If a goblin army forms, our flights will note them well in advance and we will act accordingly. Becoming paralyzed by possibilities as the other generals and commanders might is something that I deem unsuited to the nature of our work as an expeditionary force. We will be constantly exposed to the unknown and being frozen in place gets us nowhere. The general led them south along the base of the mountain, shadowing the companies clearing the way ahead. They continued their attacks, methodically going through all of the demi-human settlements identified and mapped out well before their sortie. Joachim wrinkled his nose as General Ray took his horse through the remains of a large demi-human camp. The place had been thoroughly ransacked by the company ahead of them and the bodies of goblins, ogres and direwolves littered the area. They stopped and dismounted at a pile of satchels left for them near the center of the camp. Get these direwolves skinned, the general said. Pack these bags up, as well. Lady Zaradnik walked over with her mount, eyeing the debris littering the clearing in the brush. Do you stop for every camp like this, Your Excellency? She asked. We do, my lady, General Ray answered. With how much work needs to be done, I'm debating the formation of dedicated squads that specialize in salvage operations. Our ogres make for poor scouts in this wilderness relative to our rangers, so it would give them something to do. The reports from the 2nd Legion say that they had quite the haul on their campaign, so my men are dreaming big dreams nowadays. Things aren't as extravagant here so far, but it does add up. Joachim tried to measure the Baroness' reaction to his reply. As usual, he could discern nothing. While he understood that looting enemy camps was a matter of practicality and practiced regularly across the Imperial Army, it still didn't sit well with him. Additionally, raids on demi-human settlements in the other legions were preventative or retaliatory in nature, meant to curtail risks presented by savage wilderness drives against the citizens of the Empire. What they were doing now was unprovoked aggression. The vast majority of the men, however, appeared to have become accustomed to it. That the vast majority hadn't had the chance to have the values of the Imperial Army instilled into them was likely a key factor in this, and General Ray's purposeful selection of his companies made his battalion the most aggressive of the lot. General Carbane and his commander still sorting through what they found in the blister, Lady Zaradnik said. Their campaign was short and they didn't have the luxury of completely counting out their spoils, though. Are the 6th Legion's procedures in this regard any different from Imperial standard? Broadly speaking, no. We do things the same way. A portion of the spoils stay in the division, or battalion in our case, that found them. Another portion will go towards equalizing things in the army group and the remaining portion goes into a pool for honors that are awarded periodically. For my part, I try to be prompt with distribution. We have contacts in Orenstead and courts who will purchase most of what we find. It was another product of General Ray's aggression that drove his entire campaign strategy. Army morale was propped up in a way that encouraged similarly aggressive behavior. Spoils from raids were turned into coin and the general made sure that his men were allowed to spend their leave in Orenstead and courts. Whether it was because they developed a taste for drinking and whoring or were more prudent with their earnings, the men started to consider their activities in terms of profitability. Every demi-human settlement destroyed was a drink waiting for them, the warm embrace of their favorite prostitute or a step towards a larger purchase, such as goods to impress women in the city, better equipment that might help them stand above the other soldiers or a capital to invest in what they considered promising ventures at home. By the time General Ray initiated his southern advance, his soldiers were not only blooded but highly motivated by the prospect of even greater gains. The 6th Legion's new mandate gave rise to an entirely different breed of soldier. As much as he would have liked to lay the blame entirely on General Ray and other like-minded individuals, Joachim suspected that it would have happened eventually. Historically, the Imperial Army was primarily focused on domestic security. Even their war with Riestais was done so in a highly conservative, methodical fashion that preserved the army's strength. The annexation of their rival state's territory would not be heralded by violent conquest, but by the occupation of lands buckling under overwhelming economic pressure and civil unrest. They would be welcomed as those who brought order and prosperity, freeing them from a dysfunctional government whose actions had only delivered oppression, famine and death. Since the Empire's plan was to only take what they could digest, they would be able to deliver on those hopes every single time. It was a slow takeover that would require decades, if not generations to complete. This was assuming that members of Riestais' nobility did not outright rebel against their old liege in favor of the Empire as the situation worsened for the kingdom. But what about after? Once the Empire consolidated its new territories and firmly entrenched its regime, restoring the broken halves of the original nation of Riestais, they would likely look outwards. Their resources would be more than enough to create an expeditionary army whose goal was to expand even further. They could consolidate internal frontiers and conquer the southern wilderness like they were now, claim the Azalisia Mountains or expand to the borders of the city-state alliance. The Abelian wilderness was a vast expanse of unclaimed territory ripe for the taking. Vast fleets could be launched and new territories accessed through naval exploration and conquest. The Empire did not need the Sorceress Kingdom to do this, nor did it require General Ray. All it needed was sufficient resources, political will and ambition. Joachim looked from General Ray to Baroness Saradnik. She represented a nation with the power to easily conquer vast swathes of the world in very short periods of time, yet that nation was seemingly content to exist as a single duchy while achieving hegemony in its sphere of influence. Like many powerful creatures that might be found throughout the world, it did not immediately go on an unlimited, one-sided rampage just because it could. The salvage unit completed its task, packing away everything of value and loading them onto the horses whose supplies had been spent. A distant clash sounded to the south. "Let's keep going," General Ray said as he trotted his warhorse off. "A long day awaits us."